Okay, welcome back everyone. It's June 27 of 2015. We're going to take a look at the Epistle of James, written around AD 50. And we're going to start out by just taking a look at some introductory material. We're going to basically discuss the author of the epistle, which it's been commonly agreed that it is James the Just, the brother of Jesus of Nazareth. So we're going to begin by taking a look at the titles that were given to James. He was named Iacobos the Chias, meaning Jacob the Just or James the Just, and that came from apostolic literature during the first century. And he was described as holy from his mother's womb. He never drank wine or strong drink. He was a vegetarian. He never shaved. He achieved. It's important to understand he did achieve the highest level of education. He was actually educated to the level of the high priesthood, and he did have high priest status, and he was actually an individual, a Judaic believer who was allowed into the Holy of Holies. He had actually reached that level of credentials, so that's a very distinguished education that he received, because a high priest did have to go through a formal education process. He had attained that level of becoming actually qualified as a high priest. He was known to have prayed continuously. His knees were even reported to be so calloused they were hardened, described as hardened like a camel's knees. And so he had a reputation of being someone who prayed continuously. For 3 days after the crucifixion, he fasted until he finally received report of the resurrection. He actually felt convicted, and I would say he really had his conversion experience at the crucifixion, and was confronted by the abandonment of Jesus Christ on the cross, and at the same time was probably recollecting the fact that he had ridiculed and rejected Jesus as the Messiah earlier, because remember, Jesus' immediate family rejected him, his messiahship. His cousins accepted him, but his immediate family rejected him as Messiah. They didn't understand it. James also did not understand that role. And so I think at the crucifixion he was confronted by his own guilt, and then the abandonment that Christ suffered, I think, was enough to actually create the conversion experience in him. And so he felt so ashamed and so overcome with conviction that he committed to fast continually from the crucifixion on. And he did so until 3 days later, when he received report that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And then we also see in 1 Corinthians 15:7 that Jesus actually appeared to James, and that further confirmed and validated the conversion experience that James had at the cross. But I think it's important to understand that the conversion experience took place at the crucifixion for James the Just. It was confirmed and further validated by the appearance, the resurrection appearance, described in 1 Corinthians 15:7. But the actual the information we have from extra biblical literature is that the actual conversion took place at the crucifixion. Now in Galatians 1:18 to 2:10, Paul called James one of the pillars of the church. The early Christian church had 3 stulos pillars. In other words, they were metaphorically described as pillars, as the same as the pillars in the temple, the foundational pillars of the temple. But the early church had 3 pillars. They had Simon Peter, the rock, John the beloved, and James the just. He had Simon Peter the Rock, John the Beloved, and James the Just. They were the three pillars of the early church. And we learned that with no desire for their own pride or power, that John and Peter both agreed that James the Just should be the bishop of the Jerusalem church. This was decided after the Ascension experience. That's according to writings from Clement of Alexandria of the 2nd century. So, of the three pillars, John and Simon Peter both felt that James the Just should take up that role as Bishop of Jerusalem. And Clement of Rome in the 2nd century actually declared that James was the Bishop of Bishops, the Episcopos, or the overseer for God, the guardian of souls. We learn that description as the guardian of souls in 1 Peter 2:25. James was considered the bishop of bishops, the elite, the epitome of the perfect bishop, the perfect overseer for God's kingdom. So he was a highly respected individual, and we also learned he was a tremendously educated, intelligent individual who had actually been educated all the way up through the hierarchy of the high priesthood. And that is the most elite status that a Judaic believer can achieve as far as an education is concerned. So he was at the very, very top of the educational hierarchy for the Judaic faith. But he also has the reputation of being an individual who prayed continually and an individual who was a bishop of bishops, truly someone who could be depended on for overseeing the kingdom of God. So we learn from his names and his titles that he had a tremendous reputation as being a Judaic believer. Now from here we'll move on to the second moment of his role as the writer of the Apostolic Decree. And this is where we really get into the meat of understanding what this Epistle of James is all about. If we take a look at the first Gentile letter that was composed of, and we're talking about the Council of Jerusalem, which the very first Council of Jerusalem was in AD 50, and it was, if you remember, it was concerning the rite of circumcision, and if that would be required for Gentiles. There was a dispute over the fact, would Christianity continue to be a Judaic sect, or would it become the Christianity of Antioch? And the problem arose from the Antioch congregation. And so the first Council of Jerusalem in AD 50 was all about resolving that issue. So it was like the very first council concerning Christian ethics, but it was applicable to the Gentiles. That was the issue at hand. The content was, it was decided that circumcision was not required, but the three items of the law would still be applicable for the Gentiles in Antioch. The prohibition against eating meat with blood would still remain, and the prohibition against fornication and the prohibition against idolatry would all still be required, and it would still be a part of the formal Didache letter of doctrine that was sent from James the Just to Antioch. He actually composed a Didache doctrinal letter, and actually an episcopal letter. The very first episcopal letter that we have a record of was the Council of Jerusalem of AD 50 sent to Antioch. And so it's the goal was to address the Gentile conversion issue at Antioch, and it was based on evidence given by Simon Peter in Acts 15, 7 through 29. That's where we read of this. Now we also learn in Paul's final visit in Acts 21, 17 through 18, that he had been accused of teaching the diaspora of the Jewish believers to forsake Moses. we don't have any real evidence either way on that, but that was the accusation, that he was actually teaching in the synagogues, the various synagogues in the Greek cities, to forsake the Mosaic law and covenant. And we do know in 1 Corinthians that he did mention allowing the eating of whatever was sold in the market, and that would support that accusation. But then we also have in 2 Timothy that Paul was adamant about the continuation of the study of the Torah, and very much supporting the Judaic belief. And so there's evidence on both sides. We just know that that accusation was made in Acts 21 during the final visit. So the evidence was certainly non-conclusive. Now here's the most important fact here, is that the Council of Jerusalem, we always hear about the one letter. We always hear about the Episcopal letter to Antioch, about the conversion requirements for Gentiles at the church at Antioch, and that was the first Didache letter of doctrine issued by James the Just to the Christians in Antioch from the Council of Jerusalem in AD 50. Well, the date of the Epistle to James is AD 50. It is the second Didache letter of doctrine. It's the letter that was composed by James to be sent to the Jewish audience, not the Gentile audience, but to the Jewish readers. It's the Jewish Didache letter of doctrine, written at the same time in AD 50 by James the Just, and it was to be distributed, we learn from the very first verse, to the dispersion of Jews throughout the Greek kingdom, throughout the Greek cities. It was to go to the Jewish Judaic audience. So the Epistle of James is your second Council of Jerusalem letter. That's what's a great truth to understand here. There were two Didache letters of doctrine. There was the Gentile letter and there was the Judaic letter. So our study of James is the study of the Judaic letter, and it was addressing a very critical issue, because James was confronted with two problems. I mean, basically he was a Judaic convert. He was very concerned about the fact that there was a problem of Judaizers in Jerusalem, very arrogant Judaic converts who were very legalistic, and he had to deal with that arrogance of converted Pharisees that were still felt very elite about themselves, and there was a problem of arrogance in the city of Jerusalem. But in the dispersion out throughout the Greek cities, the problem wasn't arrogance, the problem was assimilation. There you had the problem of the fact that the Christian Judaic identity was being lost as the Judaic converts were assimilating themselves into the Greek culture and losing their distinct Christian identity. And so the Jewish Didache letter of doctrine was a letter to instruct the Judaic converts to reaffirm their distinct identity as followers of Christ. So it is another Didache letter of Christian ethics, but it's applicable to the Jewish dispersion of scattered Jewish population throughout Greek cities. The content was a Didache of Threskia. Now, Threskia is the Greek term for religious practice. In other words, it was a Didache doctrinal letter of informing and instructing the readers as to how to put into practical application the Christian practice. So Threskia is practical worship, threskia. So it was a doctrine of practical worship. How do you, in a very practical way, put into action the Christian faith? Threskia. And the goal was to overcome the threat of assimilation into Greek culture and the losing of one's distinct identity as a follower of Christ. It was again based on testimony and discussion reported in Acts 15, and it was also based on James's own history and education within the Judaic faith. So that's the key here. We actually have the Epistle of James as the second Council of Jerusalem letter, and that really gives it a proper historical context. Now we understand it as an Acts 15 document. It is a very important Council of Jerusalem document. It's the Judaic document that is the other side of the coin of the Gentile document that was sent to Antioch. That takes us to the third and final moment about this, the author of James the Just. When you just take a look at his martyrdom to really understand the full picture here and understand the sacrifice and the dedication of this great Christian leader. In AD 62, so it'd be 12 years after the Council of Jerusalem, 12 years later, there was a break in a governorship between Festus was out, and Albinus had not taken over as governor yet. There was a period of a few months of an absence of a governor. And what happened is that the Jewish Sanhedrin, which was a political group, they no longer felt limited by any governorship from Rome, and so they felt that they had an autonomous power. So we learn from Josephus that the high priest Ananus, who was a Sadducee high priest, he gathered the Sanhedrin together and condemned James for breaking the law. But that wasn't the real crime. What he really wanted was for James to renounce Christ. And I also think, if you think about it, he wasn't very secure in his position. He'd only had it a couple months. And I think that his greatest political competitor, would be the most respected man in Jerusalem, James the Just. So it's another way to get rid of your competition. You know, I think he might have been jealous or afraid of losing his position to James the Just, because James the Just was extremely popular, extremely respected. But anyway, Ananus gathered the Sanhedrin together. They condemned James to death. The crime was breaking the law, the Mosaic law, the Judaic law. They took him up to we got this from Josephus' literature. They took him up to the pinnacle of the temple, and James was ordered to renounce Christ. He refused to renounce Christ, so he was thrown from that height to the ground in order to kill him, but we're told that he did not die. I mean, he was obviously near death from that, falling from that height, or being thrown from that height. So then the Sanhedrin actually stoned him in their normal way of executing those who had broken the law. But he still didn't die, we're told in this literature from Josephus. So finally, an onlooker outside the Sanhedrin actually clubbed James in the head, and in order to kill him as a mercy killing, basically, to end the torture, because he was just being tortured to death, mangled and near death, but just holding on to life, but basically he was being tortured to death. So finally someone clubbed him and killed him. After this occurred, the Pharisees protested what they considered a murder by the high priest, Ananus, to King Agrippa, and Ananus was removed from office after only 3 months serving as high priest. Now here's what's really interesting, is that the church father Origen of the 2nd century, he declared in his writings that he felt that the Ananus murder of James was the reason for God's retribution on Jerusalem, and that was the reason for the destruction of the temple in AD 70. He blamed this murder by this high priest of the most righteous and respected person, James the Just, as the reason for God's vengeance through the Roman Empire and the reason for the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So you can see how much James the Just